This is your host, Michael Shermer, and you're listening to Science Salon, a series of conversations with leading scientists, scholars, and thinkers about the most important issues of our time. If you enjoy the video, audio, and written content we produce, please show your support by making a donation at skeptic.com/donate or a monthly pledge at patreon.com/skeptic. Your ongoing patronage is vital to our organization's mission to promote science and critical thinking. Congratulations on your third book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, a sequel, as it were, in your trilogy, maybe, of Sapiens and Homo Deus. I read both of those. Actually, I listened to both of them on audio, the unabridged audio recordings, which is really a great way to consume books when you're living in Southern California, driving around a lot.
I do the same. Most of the books I read these days, I actually listen to them.
Yeah, it's good. And podcasts, I don't know if you've discovered teaching company courses, but they're also really valuable for a way of consuming time and content. So do you have a hard out here today, or how much time do you have?
I'll be in the US for about 2 weeks.
Oh, no, I mean just right now in our conversation.
Oh, right now. I was told we have an hour or so.
Yep, that sounds fine. Yeah. That sounds good. I think as an entry into your book, I want to bring up the issue of C.P. Snow's famous essay about the two cultures. Now, over half a century ago, he described this problem of the sciences and the humanities with this gaping chasm between them, and it seems like they weren't communicating well. I think this problem has largely been solved. My agent and the author and literary agent, John Brockman, calls this the third culture. These are books that are written for everybody, humanities people, science people, anybody, really. Mm-hmm. And it, excuse me, the genre sort of goes back to Darwin. The Origin of Species, for example, is not the popular version of his technical theory. It's the only version there is, and anybody can read it. And I think of Jared Diamond's books, particularly Guns, Germs, and Steel. Jared's a longtime good friend, and I know how that book was written, and it's not like he published a bunch of technical papers in scholarly scientific journals and then dumbed it down for the public in Guns, Germs, and Steel. No, Guns, Germs, and Steel is the only book and the way to get his theory. Same thing with Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, and many of Steve Pinker's books like The Blank Slate and Better Angels of Our Nature. So I think of your books in that genre, that sort of third culture genre of written for everybody, not dumbed down. This is serious writing, and yet it has a broad appeal. And I'm wondering if you sort of see yourself in that genre as an author.
Oh, yes, certainly. I think I come from the opposite direction than most of the people you mentioned. Because I come from the humanities and I try to bridge the gap from our side of the chasm. But I definitely see myself writing in the tradition of people like Jared Diamond, who was maybe had the biggest influence on me, and also Franz de Waal and Steven Pinker, certainly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's nice to see a historian. By training, I'm also a historian of science, and that our profession is alive and well in terms of talking about current events, not just the past and what's happened there. So
I think though it's critical for historians and philosophers and social critics to be far more engaged with what is happening in fields like biology and genetics and computer science. Not just because it makes their work deeper and more and more informed, but also because the most important questions are now at the borderlands between the humanities and the life sciences and information sciences. And when it comes to political and social questions, then this should be the expertise of historians and philosophers. And if they don't understand the technical aspects of these questions, then they can't contribute much.
Right. I think of Jared's books, for example, particularly Guns, Germs, and Steel, as most historians writing some narrow technical scholarly area that they're describing have a narrative in which A happens, then B happens, then C happens, then D happens, and so on. And Jared at some point just says, okay, let's stop here for a moment and ask, Why did it happen in that sequence and not some other sequence? Like, why did civilization develop at certain rates in the Middle East versus in Australia versus North America? And let's look at the geographical conditions and so on. So bringing that that sort of historical perspective integrated with scientific hypothesis testing and laying over a theoretical framework really, I think, helps bring it into sharp focus of why we should care. And I think of your books doing that.
This is what I try to do at least. And basically, the most important insight here is that humans are animals, and you cannot really understand history if you don't take into account the underlying biology and ecology. But on the other hand, humans are quite unique animals, and you cannot explain human history and current politics if the only thing you know is just biology and just brain science and just ecology. I don't think there is a satisfying biological explanation for the Second World War or for the economic crisis of 2008.
Right.
Of course, biology helps us explain them in many, many different ways. But it's not enough. You need to take culture into account. You need to take ideas and stories and fictions. And these are things which we are very far from having satisfying description of in terms of genes and neurons and neurotransmitters.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. And you do that beautifully in your books, particularly in the latest one, 21 Lessons Here for the 21st Century. I was just watching your the Economic Forum you participated at a few months ago, I guess. And it's sort of some of the big questions people ask you, almost like you're a guru. And I remember the first time I saw Stephen Hawking, he came to Southern California. He used to come to Caltech every year to work, and he would have some big public event. And people just asked him, is there a God? What's the meaning of life? Like he knows. But it reminds me a little bit of the current Jordan Peterson phenomenon of, people by the thousands turning out for his talks, asking him these deep questions. I think what you're tapping into here is a human need for meaningful stories to put some kind of framework on the apparent chaos of the world.
Yes, but I'm very much afraid of this label or image of the guru,
Yeah.
because I know very well that I don't have the answers.
Right.
I have maybe some answers to some questions, but not the answers to all the questions. And it's extremely dangerous when people turn anybody into this figure of the guru who knows everything. Then they stop thinking for themselves. And also, it's not very good for the alleged guru, because it tends to go to your head. And if you start believing in everything that people say about you, then it's not very good for your ego and for your peace of mind.
I think that's right. That's perfectly said. But still, there is a human need for some kind of structure, some kind of story. You in all your books, you talk about humans as storytellers, myth makers. Democracy is a fiction. Money is a fiction. In a way, these are useful fictions, though, that we need to bring order to the chaos. And so let's just get right into the 21 lessons. I don't know if we'll have time to go through all 21 of them, but right at the beginning, Chapter 1, Disillusionment, the End of History, has been postponed. I like that subtitle because when I was in graduate school in a PhD program in history, 1989 is when Francis Fukuyama published that famous essay, The End of History, after the fall of the communist, the Soviet Empire. And for a while it seemed like he was right. It's like all the different many countries were converting to liberal democracies, and that trend, as Pinker tracks in The Better Angels of Our Nature, that we're up to about 120 liberal democracies now, whereas a century ago in 1920, women couldn't even vote in America until 1920. So you're not technically a liberal democracy if not all your adult citizens can vote. So, we've come a long ways, and yet on the other hand, it seems like countries and national leaders are doubling down on nationalism now and not moving in the direction of a more liberal narrative. And so let's just start there with the end of history, or the end of history being postponed.
Yes, this is what everybody's talking about right now. To present it in the most general way, in the 20th century, we had three big stories to explain everything, to explain the human past and the present and what's going to be in the future. You had the fascist story, the communist story, and the liberal story. And then the Second World War knocked out the fascist story. And the second half of the 20th century was this great ideological battle between communism and liberalism. And then communism collapsed, and the liberal story remained as our only guide to the past, to the present, and to the future. And this is when people started talking about the end of history, not in the sense that nothing will happen anymore, but in the sense that we now know where we are heading. We know the end of the story. We just need to sit and watch it happen. And then an amazing thing happened, or is happening, which is that the liberal story is now collapsing. And this creates not just disillusionment, but panic and bewilderment, because the shift from a single story that explains everything to having zero stories is the most unsettling thing you can think about. I mean, if you move from two stories to one story, it actually creates more certainty. Okay, now we know the answers. But then to move from one story to zero, this is extremely difficult mentally to cope with. And one of the results, or one of the solutions, or at least a temporary solution, is to bring out of the attic all kinds of fantasies about the past, all kinds of stories which we thought, at least, that we have left behind a long time ago. And you see a revival of nationalism and of religion as something to fill the vacuum with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember when we were in the middle of the Afghan and Iraqi wars, and George W. Bush was making his argument for the case for democracy, and he referenced Nathan Sharansky's book, The Case for Democracy, The Power of Freedom to Overcome Tyranny and Terror. And I thought, yeah, that's a really good argument. But on the other hand, the idea of sending the troops in to help bring about democracy seems problematic. And that's exactly what's happened, particularly in Iraq, of backfiring against that idea of bringing democracy to people that, well, you don't want to say they're not capable of it or they don't want it, but the country is too tribal to unite under a larger democratic umbrella, I think.
I'm not an expert on Iraq, so I'm not sure what went wrong there, but something obviously went very, very wrong there. And, it's, again, 15 years ago, the Americans were trying to impose liberal democracies on countries, unwilling countries and populations on the other side of the world. And now, 15 years later, they are having doubts about their own liberal democracy. So we've definitely come a very long way from the invasion of Iraq.
Yeah. Yeah, by the way, I should note parenthetically at the beginning of your book, in the intro, you say that you're critical of much of the liberal philosophy and campaign, but not that you don't think it's good, that we must be able to criticize ourselves from within. So I think that serves a useful purpose. There are many issues like forcing democracy on people that just doesn't work. And yet, on the other hand, we can't ignore the threats to civil rights and civil liberties around the world. I'm reminded of in the Clinton administration, he did not intervene in Rwanda soon enough, and hundreds of thousands of people died in that genocide, and he was severely criticized for that. So he does intervene in Kosovo, and then he's accused of being the world's policeman, running around intervening in other people's businesses. It just seems like no matter what you do, you're going to be criticized, but it's difficult to know what's the right thing to do.
Well, that's always the case. When you are very powerful, no matter what you do, you will attract some criticism. If you just want to please everybody, you will never succeed in doing that. Mm-hmm. But I think that the main problem now, I would say, with liberal democracy and liberalism is not so much the attempt to impose it through force and violence on other countries. It's I would say that the difficulty in formulating any meaningful vision for the future of humanity, and even more so the difficulty of coming to terms with the scientific discoveries and technological inventions of this generation. I would say that, again, from a long-term perspective, the biggest problem of liberalism is that humans are now hackable animals, and this doesn't sit well with the liberal worldview. Mm-hmm. Once you can hack human beings, by that I mean that you can understand them better than they understand themselves. You cannot just predict their choices. You can increasingly manipulate and control their desires, their feelings, and ultimately you could perhaps even replace them. And the idea that you can hack people and you can really control and manipulate their feelings and emotions makes a mockery of the liberal ideas of elections and of the free market. And until today, it wasn't such a big problem because we didn't have the technology. Even if it was never true that humans make choices out of free will and that my feelings reflect some kind of metaphysical spirit, even though it was never true, nobody ever had the technology to hack human beings. And now we are beginning to have that technology, or at least some of us. So this now becomes a practical problem, not a philosophical problem. I mean, the philosophical arguments about free will and how people make decisions, they are thousands of years old. But thousands of years ago, or even a couple of decades ago, nobody had the biological knowledge and the computing power necessary to hack human beings, and now we have them. And this, I would say, is the greatest long-term threat to liberal democracy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when the Russian hacking story first broke, I at first thought, this is kind of treating Democrats like they're automata, like they can't think, they have no volition. They're just being pushed around through social media by these Russian hackers. But when you think about what influences us and how we make our decisions and all the cognitive psychology research on that, we are pretty autonomous automations in that sense that somebody like a Google or a Facebook or a Twitter can push around our preferences without us even knowing it. So it seems like what you've described is already underway.
Yeah, I mean, it has been prepared by a century and a half of research in biology and in brain science. Ultimately, what Darwin tells us, and what all the latest research in brain science tells us, is that organisms are algorithms, and that our decisions and our choices and our feelings reflect biochemical algorithms, extremely complicated ones, which is why up till now nobody was able to decipher them. But if you have enough data, if you have enough understanding of biology, and if you have enough computing power, it's not impossible to hack these algorithms. And then you can control and manipulate people. And what we have seen with the Russian hackers and with the trolls over the last couple of years, or with YouTube pushing to us funny cat videos and Amazon pushing products to us, this is really just the beginning or the tip of the iceberg. Because up till now, most of the analysis, most of the hacking of human beings has been done on the basis of external signals, of where you go and what you search online and which kind of videos you watch on YouTube and what you buy and things like that. But the real turning point will be when we will start having enormous amounts of biometric data coming from within our bodies. So whether it's Amazon or whether it's Netflix or whether it's the government or whether it's the Russian hackers, they will be able to track not just what we buy or what we search for, but what is happening to our hearts and brains as we do it. what is happening to our hearts and brains really every moment of our life. And the kind of information you can gain from that is really mind-boggling. And we really will be in a situation when an external system can understand me much better than my mother understands me, much better than my husband understands me, much better than I understand myself. And this is a philosophical question, and it's also a very practical political question. Our institutions, whether in the political system or in the economic system, have not been built to deal with this kind of situation.
Maybe I shouldn't have signed up for the 23andMe genome scan. It was just kind of on a whim to write one of my Scientific American columns about it, but now they have my data. Well, that gets into your chapters 3 and 4 on liberty and equality, about big data and to what extent we're free. Let me note parenthetically, I just got back from Moscow for a science conference, and I had an extra day to do some sightseeing. So I went to their big Victory Park, which is what we would call a World War II museum. They don't call it that. It's the Great Patriotic War Museum. And I saw nowhere reference the Second World War, just the Great Patriotic War. And I thought, oh boy, we are a long ways from this naive vision I have of, all countries in the world are liberal democracies like America. I mean, history has not ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Empire. I mean, they still very much see themselves as a national character of a certain type, different from other national characters.
Yes, it was never true that all the world, definitely not a liberal democracy, and also not on the way of becoming a liberal democracy. It was a widespread theory for a short while, but looking back, it doesn't seem that this was ever the case.
Right, and this museum is unbelievable. Just how many people died. I mean, tens of millions of Soviet, mostly men, in just the war itself. Not to mention what Stalin did to his own people and all that. They don't mention that, of course, but just
it is true that certainly when you look at the numbers, World War II in Europe was a war between Germany and its allies and the Soviet Union.
Yeah,
and everything else was a small sideshow, at least until the end of 1944. I mean, in the Western Desert in North Africa, Rommel had 2 German divisions and a couple of Italian divisions, whereas on the Eastern Front, you're talking about battles and fronts involving hundreds of divisions. So they have some point in dismissing much of the war efforts of the other allies, at least on the European front.
Yeah, they have this one room where the entire ceiling is just this dense chains hanging down from the ceiling, tiny little chains like you might have for your keys, and just maybe hundreds of thousands of these chains hanging down. Each little ball on the chain or link in the chain represents I don't know how many 100 people died or something. It totals like 26 million, and it just puts into the shade, the kinds of losses Americans and British and French experienced versus the Russians. So no wonder they have a strong claim about Eastern Europe and all those countries that were in the middle of all that.
And many of these countries were actually Nazi allies. I mean, we tend to think about the Second World War. Again, I'm talking about the European front as everybody against the Germans or against the Germans and Italians. But actually, for quite a long time, most of Europe was allied to Nazi Germany.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So, that's one good argument for traveling a lot is to get you out of your bubble. It's hard to live in America, and I'm in California, so it's even worse how distant we are from that. At least you're in Israel, where you're closer to where the action is. I think I've been to Israel twice, and anyway, that's a different subject. But so let's get to liberty and equality. Those who own the data own your future. Big data is watching you. Just on a parenthetical note, do you call yourself a compatibilist or a determinist, or you believe in libertarian free will, or where do you stand on that issue?
On free will?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think that the term has any meaning.
Yeah.
I never really understood what people refer to when they speak about free will. Humans obviously have a will. We have desires. And if you talk about the freedom to fulfill or to realize our desires, then yes, this is something I can understand. I want something and somebody is obstructing me and I'm fighting for what I want. This is totally understandable. But philosophically, it seems that people who talk about free will, they talk about the freedom to choose my desires. And this makes absolutely no sense. It's very obvious, both philosophically but also experientially, that I don't choose my desires. I have a will, but it isn't free. I mean, then the next thought that pops up in my mind, or the next desire that pops up in my mind, I didn't choose to have this thought or to have this feeling. And it's on another level, it's very obvious that what we choose to do, our choices, they are never independent. They are dependent on so many biochemical and genetic and cultural and environmental factors that this image of me making my choices completely freely and independently of the world, I understand the theological roots where it's coming from Judeo-Christian theology. But in scientific terms, it makes absolutely no sense. Again, you can also think about it as some kind of ideal that I want one day to have a free will, in the sense that my choices, my actions are less and less influenced by the manipulations of the world. Mm-hmm. But it should be obvious to everybody, even those who believe in free will, it should be obvious to them that 99% of the choices people make, they don't stand up to this ideal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to read this passage from your book. It's such great writing. This is in the chapter Meaning, about the liberal story and the role of volition in that. The liberal story instructs me to seek freedom, to express and realize myself. But both the self and freedom are mythological chimeras borrowed from the fairy tales of ancient times. Liberalism has a particularly confused notion of free will. Humans obviously have a will, they have desires, and they are sometimes free to fulfill those desires. If by free will you mean the freedom to do what you desire, then yes, humans have free will. But if by free will you mean the freedom to choose what to desire, then no, humans have no free will. I thought that was artfully put. I mean, I get this feeling like when Amazon sends me a little push notice that, if you like this book, when I look something up, you might like these. I often do like those books, so it does seem to know. But I'm glad for that.
It will get better and better.
Yeah, so I mean, it helps with my research in that sense. But on the other hand, I feel like I don't have to buy the book. But what you're arguing here is that it knows my desires from past purchases, and it's tempting me. And maybe if it sent you the same books, well, maybe not you, but somebody who isn't interested in history and these same subjects, they would just not be interested at all. So that's what you mean by desire. The desires.
Yes, and even if you choose, I won't buy these books just to prove that the Amazon doesn't understand me or something. Then where did this desire come from? Maybe it's because you have a contrarian personality and you feel a very strong pressure to resist authority. But you did not choose to have this personality to resist authority, and because of that, to resist the temptations of Amazon. Now you can try and train yourself. Let's say you don't have this strong personality of resisting authority, but you think it's a good idea to have such a personality. So you can train yourself in a million ways to be more independent-minded and more resistant to authority. But then you should ask yourself, and where does this desire come from? Mm-hmm. Why do I suddenly have this desire to have a different personality than what I have, and to work so hard on achieving it? And this is obviously an infinite regression. No matter where you try to stand, you can always ask yourself, and why do I want to stand there? Why do I have this desire? And in the vast majority of cases, people don't go through even the first or second steps of this regression. Something pops up in their mind and they just do it. You know, you have a link in contemporary terms, if you all these fake news and hackers phenomena. So they get to know you. And if they discover, for example, that you already have a bias against, I don't know, then President Trump, so they know that if they show you some outrageous headline about Trump, which might be completely fictitious, like Trump says, we must kill all the Muslims or something like that, you would have an almost irresistible urge to click on this headline. Mm-hmm. And as you click on it, you feel that you are exercising your will. I'm free to do what I want. And this is true. You are free to exercise your will and click on the headline. But the bias itself and the desire to click on the headline, you did not choose them. Mm-hmm. And this is the way to manipulate you.
I wonder if, actually, let me read this sentence from your book because it's so captive of that. We don't have free will, but we can be a bit more free from the tyranny of our will. So would meditation be an example of that, where you get closer to understanding where the thoughts are coming from that bubble up from who knows where?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I practice Vipassana meditation. I try to meditate 2 hours every day, and I go every year for a 60 days meditation retreat. And much of the practice is exactly that. Something pops up, and you just observe. You don't identify with whatever pops up. You just observe it, and you watch how it changes, how it becomes greater, more powerful, and then suddenly maybe disappear, and something else comes up. And the more you observe, the more you realize this isn't me. I shouldn't be identified with all these thoughts and emotions and desires that pop up. And I certainly don't need to give them control over my life.
Right. So how would you apply this to the larger issue of liberty, freedom, not just you and I having individual volition when we make choices, not that argument, but nationally or internationally, we talk about we want to promote freedom and equality and liberty and so on. But what we're talking about here is that people don't really have that. So maybe we're talking about the architecture of society that allows people to express their desires wherever those come from.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say again that the philosophical issue and the scientific issue is not new. What we just said was true in 1776 mm-hmm. and was true in 1945, just that it is true today. The difference is that in 1776, nobody else besides you had the ability to understand what's happening inside your brain and inside your mind and use that to their advantage and manipulate and control you. So because nobody had this ability, it was reasonable enough and it was safe enough to trust in the voter and in the customer. The idea that the voter always knows best and the customer is always right. Mm-hmm. The basis for liberal democracy and for free market economics. But once somebody has the ability to hack your brain and hack your mind, it no longer works. And we need a new political and economic system. And I don't have the solutions of what will replace the current system. The main problem is that we hardly even began the debate. This is maybe the most important debate we should be having, but we are engaged with completely different issues. And most of the people who feel that something doesn't work well with the current system, they tend to look back instead of forward and to retreat to all kinds of nostalgic fantasies about let's go back to some imaginary golden age and revive that system.
Right. I wrote about that in Heavens on Earth, this utopian desire to recreate the paradisiacal state that used to be. If only you put our party in charge, we'll do that. And everybody does that, Trump more than anybody recently, but it's not new. That's a very old story. And yet it seems it's just almost impossible to think, how can you have a structured society without some kind of government and some kind of corporations or business or industry where people can trade? You talk about those two major entities. They may be fictional, but they're certainly useful fictions, the state and corporations. Mm-hmm. It seems like at the moment, with this like digital dictatorships that are coming, the only way to keep a check on that would be literally just laws that tell Google you can't sell the data, or just restrictions, regulations. They may be violated, but at least if you have laws that are enforceable, you can try to keep a check on digital dictators.
I think that laws would be ineffective, both because they will stop a lot of positive progress and because it will be extremely difficult to enforce them. It's better to try and work with the technology than against it. And it can be done on many levels and in many different ways. On the individual level, people, it's the oldest advice in the book, know yourself, but it's now more important than ever because you now have competition. If in the days of Socrates or Buddha, you did not make the effort to get to know yourself and your weaknesses and your habit patterns better, then okay, so you did not know yourself very well, but you're still a black box to the rest of humanity. But now you have very serious competition. As we speak, Amazon and the Russian FSB and the Chinese Communist Party and the American NSA, they are all trying to hack you. Mm-hmm. And if they know you better than you know yourself, they can manipulate you very easily. The better you know yourself, for instance, your weaknesses, the easier it is for you to defend yourself. If you know that you have a bias against something, it's more difficult to utilize that bias against you. Now, many people are unlikely to have the discipline, the time, the inclination to really get to know themselves. So we can perhaps use technology to fight or to protect ourselves against technology. At present, all these big data algorithms and AI mostly serve the big corporations and governments. But we can use the same technologies to protect people, to create, for example, an AI defender or an AI sidekick that gets to know you and knows, again, your weaknesses. And whenever somebody is trying to exploit these weaknesses, it comes to your help. The same way that we have antivirus programs for our computers, we need antivirus programs for our brains and for our minds. And, if you have, a weakness for funny cat videos, and YouTube is trying to make you waste another hour watching these funny cat videos, so your AI sidekick could just come along and block it or alert you that, look, this is what is happening right now. So this is on the individual level. On the collective level, there are all kinds of possibilities and schemes to create organizations and unions that will protect users against the big corporations or the governments, in the same way that it has been done previously in history. I mean, it's not the means are different, but the principles are not completely new. And of course, there is a lot to be done, again, on the technological front, in thinking about which kinds of technologies we want to develop. At present, AI and machine learning seem to be empowering hierarchical and centralized systems. But a lot of people think that blockchain technology may be the counterbalance by making distributed systems more efficient than centralized systems. So we can consciously invest more time, more effort, more money in developing blockchain as a counterbalance to the danger of big data algorithms. So there are many things to do besides just government regulation or laws that forbid this or forbid that.
Yeah, that's kind of going backwards, the way things have always been done. Just pass more laws and regulate technology and industry. You're saying diversify, have technological solutions to problems, and go forward.
Yes, of course, we do need regulations. We do need laws as well. But the idea that the only solution will come from some government regulation, I'm very skeptical whether this can really solve the kind of crisis that we are facing.
Mm-hmm. You know, we're about to colonize Mars, maybe, in the next few decades. And I started writing about this for an article for Scientific American. And so I, just for fun, tweeted at Elon Musk, when you start the first Mars colony, what documents would you recommend using to establish a governing system? U.S. Constitution / Bill of Rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Humanist Manifesto, Atlas Shrugged, Against the State, and Anarcho-Capitalist Manifesto, ? And he writes back immediately, direct democracy by the people. Laws must be short, as there is trickery in length. Automatic expiration of rules to prevent death by bureaucracy. Any rule can be removed by 40% of the people to overcome inertia. Freedom. He packed a lot in those 217 characters. What do you think about that? This idea, I mean, everything that you've been writing about, this could be tested within the next few decades with a brand new society on a different planet.
I tend to be skeptical of utopias, especially utopias that demand too much from human nature. Direct democracy can go wrong in so many different ways. Again, if you think that human desires and human choices reflect some kind of metaphysical spirit or free will, then yes, maybe. But when you realize what actually shapes the desires and choices of most people, I'm not sure that giving complete free expression and power directly to the desires of every individual is the best way to go about building a peaceful and prosperous society.
Right. I in writing this essay, I quote James Madison's Federalist Paper number 51. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself. And it seems like that's going to be true on any planet if it's people that are colonizing it.
Which becomes increasingly unlikely. People are problematic not just in the political sense, but also in the biological sense. It's so difficult to keep people alive in outer space or on other planets. We have been adapted by 4 billion years of evolution to living on this particular rock in the universe. And not just we, but all organisms. We have been adapted to this atmosphere, to this distance from the sun, to this level of cosmic radiation, and so forth and so on. It's going to be extremely difficult to maintain large number of humans or any organisms in long-distance travels in outer space and or other planets. So I do think that somebody will colonize other planets and maybe even other solar systems, but I find it hard to believe that it will be Homo sapiens. I think far more likely it will either be cyborgs combining organic and inorganic parts, or completely inorganic entities, maybe controlled from afar by organic entities on Earth, but the ones who are going to go to Neptune or to Alpha Centauri, I find it hard to believe that they will be flesh and blood organisms like us.
Of any distance, even Mars is so far away of just sending bodies there. Yeah, you're probably right about other solar systems for sure. In this essay, I interviewed Charles Cockell. He's an biophysicist in England who has actually written about this, which I didn't know there's a little body of literature about colonizing other planets. And he points out that when somebody can control the air and the water, then you have the formula for tyranny, and that's going to be a huge problem. It's not like if you don't like your government, you just go off into the woods with your friends and start a new government or throw a revolution. You can't go anywhere because there's no air. And so there would have to be some way of people having the opportunity to control their own air, production of water or whatever, or else you're going to have worse tyranny than we've ever had on Earth.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
And then the additional problem, which I think gets back to some of the issues you talk about in your book, that I quote from Jared Diamond when he talks about the hunter-gatherer peoples he engages with in Papua New Guinea. If you have a small band of say 20 people, you can resolve conflicts by sitting down in the evening and having a little town square meeting, as it were. But if you multiply that 20 into say 2,000, it comes up with 1,999,000 possible dyads. You multiply 2,000 by 1999 divided by 2. And so this 100-fold population increase produces a 10,000-fold dyadic rise. And then I quote him from Guns, Germs, and Steel. Once the threshold of several hundred, below which everyone can know everyone else, has been crossed, increasing numbers of dyads become pairs of unrelated strangers. Hence, a large society that continues to leave conflict resolution to all of its members is guaranteed to blow up. That factor alone would explain why societies of thousands can exist only if they develop centralized authority to monopolize force and resolve conflict. And therefore, that's why we are where we are. We have states, nations, large governments. It seems almost impossible to get around that in thinking of is there some other solution to this problem?
With Homo sapiens, with humans, no. If you change something about the basic mechanism of the brain to such an extent that it's no longer Homo sapiens, but a different kind of animal or a different kind of entity, then all sorts of possibilities open up. But with Homo sapiens, I fully agree with Jared Diamond. Once you pass the threshold of a couple of dozen or a couple of hundred individuals, then you cannot just share authority between everybody. And this is something that I think not just liberal utopians don't understand. It's also true of nationalists, that they often fail to understand the crucial difference between a nation and the original clans and tribes that characterized our species. You often hear, especially these days, that nationalism is natural to human beings, that nationalism is somehow imprinted in our genes, and that therefore we must be loyal to the nation, and any attempt to go beyond the loyalty to the nation is doomed to failure. And this is absolute nonsense. Nationalism is extremely unnatural to Homo sapiens. Nations, as against small clans, are groups of millions of complete strangers. For millions of years, Homo sapiens and other humans were adapted to live in small, intimate communities in which everybody knows everybody else. This is the key characteristic. You must know everybody else personally in your clan or in your tribe. And in nations, it's never the case. Israel, for example, is quite a small nation, certainly compared to the US or to China. Still, we have 8 million people here, and I definitely don't know all the other 8 million Israelis. Mm-hmm. And no Israeli knows all the other 8 million Israelis. 99.99% of them are complete strangers to me. I've never met them, and I will never meet them. I don't know them personally. So the key problem and also achievement of nationalism is how do you make complete strangers not just trust one another, but cooperate effectively? And you do it in all kinds of ways. And nations have been some of the most successful systems of cooperation in human history. But they are absolutely not natural to our species. And they appeared only in the last few thousand years at most. So this kind of rhetoric, which links modern nations with ancient tribes and tries to claim, therefore, that nations are somehow natural to our species, this is complete nonsense.
Yeah, but it's a powerful nonsensical fiction, and as you describe in your book, we are storytelling animals, and that particular narrative does seem to tap into our tribal instincts in a way that those other 8 million people you don't know are honorary members of your extended family.
Yeah, of course, it kind of, it rides upon or it latches onto mechanisms, brain mechanisms, mind mechanisms that evolved for millions of years. All successful human systems must be able to rely on these deep mechanisms. But it doesn't mean that they are natural or ancient. Pianos and computer keyboards are engineered in order to make use of our fingers, which evolved for completely different purposes. But now they function amazingly well if you know how to use them. Mm-hmm. And it's the same with nations. I mean, you take the basic emotional and cognitive mechanisms of humans, which evolved under completely different circumstances, and you hijack them for a very different purpose. And it's true of so many different things in history. For example, if you look, for example, at group hatreds, at the way that you make people hate entire groups of people, again, which you never met before. It's not like somebody insulted you personally or somebody did something wrong to you personally. How do you make people hate millions of strangers? And you do it by hijacking the mechanisms in the brain which are responsible above all for disgust. Mm-hmm. There is a lot of very interesting research on how the enemy is in so many ways disgusting. They don't smell good, they are a source of pollution, and so forth and so on. And you see in almost all cultures, not only enemies beyond the hill that you never met, but when you want to ostracize or to discriminate, even against an internal group, you very often mobilize the mechanisms of disgust. For example, the discrimination against women in many societies is based on the idea that women are a source of ritual impurity. Mm-hmm. And
you mean the menstruation?
For example, during menstruation, and this is like why they can't be priests and why they can't be rabbis and why they can't be allowed near the holy text and things like that. And this is really just hijack. I mean, the mechanisms of disgust, they evolved to protect us against real sources of impurity, like puke or feces or dead bodies rotting, so you feel disgusted. But human culture have learned how to latch on to these brain mechanisms and make us feel visceral disgust against other people who just in our imagination are a source of pollution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the basis really of most genocides, even to the point of cliche of using things like cockroaches and vermin, disease, bacilla, rats. Yeah. Pretty much every genocidal group does that to another group. I mentioned being at the Victory Park in Moscow with the Great Patriotic War Museum. One hall exhibits all the propaganda posters from 1941 to 1945 depicting Germans. Now, this is kind of enlightening to me because my wife is from Germany. She's from Cologne, Germany. And, of course, they don't see themselves as these, evil, dripping vermin, terrible, demonic creatures. But that's exactly what's portrayed in these posters. This is what the Germans will do to our women and children, especially women and children. And that's.
So again, I must say that in the case of the Germans in the Second World War, these posters were less distant from reality.
Yes, that's right.
Than in most cases.
Yeah, that's right. I wrote this book, The Moral Arc, in which I quote from in my chapter on evil. I quote from this book. It's a collection of letters written by the Einsatzgruppen as they were riding home from their Eastern European and into the Ukraine, following the Wehrmacht, and how they had to kill all these Jews and what life was like if they weren't doing what they were doing. All justification, of course. If I didn't kill all these people here, they would be doing this to you at home, my beloved so and so. And so that narrative goes both ways. But yeah, they did. I mean, during that time it was pretty brutal. And yet Germans today are amongst the least bellicose people in the Western world. So it's not if it is a genetic basis to it, it can be reversed through culture and education pretty quickly.
Definitely. It's never genetic. It's never biological. I mean, all these things are 99% cultural. For all the talk about national character can change so quickly within the lifetime of an individual. I mean, the Germans today have the same genes, the same climate, the same geography, the same everything as the Germans during the Nazi era. In some cases, they are even the same people, yet they behave in a completely different way. So as a historian, I would say that all this talk about national character, especially if people think that it's based on genes and on biology, this is also mostly nonsense.
Yeah. I've been convinced more and more of late that that phrase, no Hitler, no Holocaust, no Hitler, no Second World War, that sometimes history really can come down to just one person or one small group that somehow gets a toehold and takes over the ideology and the politics of a nation, even if the majority don't want it. What do you think about that?
Sometimes it's true. I mean, the bigger the process, the less influence individuals and small groups have on it. The Industrial Revolution was not the outcome of any single person or small group or even nation. It's given the circumstances, the economic, the political circumstances in Western Europe in the 17th and 18th century, it probably would have happened, even if some of the great names were not born or were killed in childhood. But as you focus on more particular events or turns of events, then yes, nothing is deterministic, and there is a very large role for small groups, for single individuals, and just for plain luck. And this can have long-term consequences. For example, I don't think there was anything deterministic about the rise and spread of Christianity. In the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire was a bit like California today. It was a supermarket of religious faith and all kinds of esoteric sects from the East and gurus and whatnot. And there was absolutely nothing deterministic about this tiny Jewish sect taking over the empire and then using it as a base for spreading eventually around the world to become the largest faith of all. Mm-hmm. I guess if you would have rerun the movie of history 100 times, I would be surprised if anybody would have heard about Christianity more than 3 or 4 times out of these 100 times. And it's the same to a large extent with the spread of Islam. There was absolutely nothing deterministic about this small sect from the Arabian Peninsula becoming one of the largest forces in history. And it's the same with the Communist revolution in the Bolshevik revolution in Russia a century ago. There were very, very few Bolsheviks. It was really a chain of accidents and a lot of good luck for the Bolsheviks that they managed to gain control of Russia at the time they did. And you can give a lot of other similar examples, I guess, from the whole of history.
Oh, it's striking. I had Bart Ehrman on the podcast a few months ago, his new book on the triumph of Christianity. And, you go from a couple of dozen people to hundreds of millions in just a couple centuries when change was super slow at that time. It's really quite striking. It's almost unbelievable. Of course, Christians would say it's a miracle because that's what God wanted.
Yeah, but if the Mithra religion had won, then you would have today hundreds of millions of Mithra believers,
right,
saying that this is the proof that their religion was right all along.
Yeah, let's talk about your chapters in 21 Lessons for the 21st Century on God and Religion. I'll read this passage from the chapter on God. When all is said and done, it is a matter of semantics. When I use the word God, I think of the God of the Islamic State, of the Crusades, of the Inquisition, and of the God hates fags banners. When I think of the mystery of existence, I prefer to use other words so as to avoid confusion. And unlike the God of the Islamic State and the Crusades, who cares a lot about names and above all about his most holy name, the mystery of existence doesn't care an iota what names we apes give it. That's just a great passage. You're such a beautiful writer. But you're an atheist, right?
You can say I don't believe in any God. I don't consider myself an atheist because I don't define myself. But I'm not a cat either.
In other words, you don't define yourself by what you don't believe.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. We don't have to have the labels. I don't like them. I call myself a skeptic just because I have a magazine called Skeptic. Sometimes atheist because that's what people want to put you in that box. Agnostic is the word Thomas Henry Huxley coined it just to mean it's not knowable in any scientific sense. But regardless of what you and I believe on it, it's kind of irrelevant since billions of people do, and it does affect even the modern society, even in the teeth of the fact that the nuns are the fastest growing religious cohort in the world, the people that tick the box for no religious affiliation, at least in the Western world. In the middle of that, which atheists and humanists have been celebrating for the last few years, you do still see this rise of, say, militant Islam or some militancy Christianity in parts of the world. Still going on. The Middle East, where you live, there's still tensions there. I think we're a long way from a secular world where God is irrelevant.
Oh, definitely. But I would say that religion has really changed during the last few centuries to the degree that people simply forgot what it used to be. For much of history, religion was the highest authority on many technical and practical matters. Religion was about agriculture, it was about medicine, it was about transportation, about security. If you want your flocks to prosper and if you want to have enough rain for the fields, you perform ceremonies, you go to the priests, you pray to God. If somebody is sick or if there is an epidemic, again, this is a religious matter, and the experts are the priests, the rabbis, the shamans, the gurus. It's the same if you want to win a war or if you want to provide safety on the road, so you pray to God. And religion has completely lost almost all of these functions. And if you think about Jesus, so for at least half the time, Jesus was just practicing medicine. He was healing the sick. He was giving eyesight to the blind. And what happened over the last 2, 3, 4 centuries is that religion has completely lost, almost completely lost, its authority in all these fields to such an extent that people have simply forgotten that it ever laid claim to authority in these fields. And even the most religious people will tell you, so what if I don't go to the priest and I go to the doctor or I go to the engineer? This is not the business of religion at all. Mm-hmm. And this is the most maybe important transformation that religion has underwent. And it really reduced its power and influence in a tremendous way. The only field, or only important field, in which religion is still important is in matters of identity, of deciding who am I and who are my people, and whom should they cure and whom should I fight against. And here religion is still very important. And but also, even if in this field, something happened in the last few generations, that religion in most cases became subservient to nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
That, originally Christianity was certainly not a national religion, and Islam was not a national religion, and Hinduism was not a national religion. They were not about the nation. But what happened in the last few generations is that even the role of religion in defining identity actually became subservient in most cases to the needs and interests of the state. And the state is now using religion as its handmaid. If you look at places like Hungary or Poland, where Catholicism is used to cement the national Hungarian or Polish identity. In Russia, the same thing is done with Orthodox Christianity. In Israel with Judaism, in Turkey with Sunni Islam, in Iran with Shiite Islam, in Saudi Arabia with Wahhabism, in India with Hinduism, and so forth and so on. And for all the talk of religion, it's now mainly, or at least the most important role that religion plays, is to serve as a tool in the hands of national movements and national governments. And this is a turn of event that I would say people like Jesus and Muhammad would be very, very disappointed to see.
81% of evangelical Christians voted for Trump.
Who is not the paragon of Christian virtues.
He has to be the least Christian president we've ever had since maybe Jefferson, who was a deist. Yeah, it was striking. It was a clear indication to me that nationalism had taken over, and religion, in its purest form, was irrelevant, at least in politics. But what about the role of religion still, say, in manning the soup kitchens, helping the poor, that kind of thing? If the government doesn't do it, like one explanation for why Western European countries are not nearly as religious as America is that their government takes care of their poor people, whereas in the United States, our poorest social safety net needs a supplement of private welfare and health care and so forth, and that's what religion does.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a traditional role of many religious organizations. And this has been one of the most important contributions of religion to humankind. I don't see religion as an evil force. It's, like every major force in history, it has its benefits, and it also caused a lot of harm. So it's a complex phenomena, but certainly the encouragement that many religions give to people to be less egoistic and to care about others, to care about strangers, to help the poor, to give charity, to be more compassionate. As far as it goes, this is wonderful.
Mm-hmm. You wouldn't want to get rid of that part of it.
No, I mean, of course, it can be replaced. I mean, secular people can be as compassionate and as helpful to the poor as religious people. Religion is not a must in this regard. And certainly no single religion has a monopoly over charity or over compassion. But if somebody is motivated to be more compassionate and more charitable because she believes in Jesus, or because she believed this is what Allah wants her to do, then this is wonderful. And I wouldn't like to undermine this aspect of religion.
Yeah. In the atheist humanist community, there's at least a branch pushing toward creating something like spiritual centers in every city where you go, and you can go to a place where you can have weddings and funerals and dating services and babysitting, and every Sunday morning they sing hymns to Newton and light candles and have testimonials about how they lost their religion and love science. And the presumption there, I think, is that there's a human need for something that religion fulfills, and if we're going to get rid of religion through science or whatever, we better replace it with something.
No, I don't think there is an absolute need. You can certainly have morality without God and without religion. You just need to cultivate your appreciation of suffering. and your compassion in the face of suffering to be a moral person. You don't need to believe in any mythical story. And similarly, you don't need religion to have a community. Communities can form in many ways and around many ideas, and religion is just one way to do it.
Yeah, you write this toward the end of your book under the chapter on meaning, which is a really powerful way to end the book. We humans have conquered the world thanks to our ability to create and believe fictional stories. We are therefore particularly bad at knowing the difference between fiction and reality. Overlooking this difference has been a matter of survival for us. If you nevertheless want to know the difference, the place to start is with suffering. Because, as noted earlier, the realest thing in the world is suffering. So that's kind of the basis, or where you begin with morality, is, you know, the sensitivity to the suffering of others, including animals, which I guess, yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that morality is not about obeying any god or any holy book. Morality is about reducing suffering in the world.
And to a certain extent, one of the jobs of science and technology is to do that. If you can envision, as you do in Homo Deus, the, you know, sort of a post-scarcity economy where no one's impoverished anymore, that reduces suffering by quite a bit. And if we can replace all animals, well, meat, if we can replace meat with synthetic meat, so-called clean meat, that would reduce the amount of suffering on factory farms, for example.
Certainly. But, you know, almost every technology and every scientific discovery has potential for both good and evil. And I would say that the science by itself is interested mainly in power, in how to gain more and more power. And even the interest in truth, in understanding reality, at least on the institutional basis, is really the interest in how do I understand this better in order to control it more effectively, in order to increase my power. So you do need to add something to science to make sure that the discoveries and inventions are used for good and not for evil.
Yeah, because here I'm thinking of turning moral issues into more pragmatic, solvable problems, like if you want to reduce the amount of crime or homicides or wars.
No, but first you need to agree that this is a problem, or that this is the most important problem. The priorities, I mean, science, if you give it a problem and you say, okay, find a cure to cancer, then yes, science kicks in. But if you need to decide whether the most important thing now is, again, let's take the situation of animals as an example, whether the most pressing issue is to increase the dairy production of cows, or whether the most pressing issue is to reduce the suffering of cows, then, you know, these are two completely different paths. And science by itself is not very good in choosing the correct path here.
So how do so what does do that? Well, we do it as a collective, I guess, as a democracy. We decide what we want our goals to be, and then science and technology will help us get there or not.
Here again, I think that the key thing, and it is related to science, is to better understand suffering and the cause of suffering in the world, and an appreciation of what it means to suffer, and therefore compassion towards those who suffer. And it still has a lot to do with science. For example, realizing that animals can suffer, this in itself is also a scientific project, because you have many people even today who claim that animals, that cows, that chickens, that pigs, they are just kind of machines for producing meat and milk and eggs, and they have no emotions and no sensations, and they can't feel pain, and they can't feel fear, and they can't feel depression, and so forth. And now we have a lot of scientific evidence to prove or to indicate that this is just not the case. That all mammals and all birds, they have a mind, they have consciousness, they have the ability to experience at least some sensations and emotions. Not the same as human beings, not the same as Homo sapiens, but certainly things like pain, like fear, they are part of the experience of cows and pigs just as much as of Homo sapiens.
Mm-hmm. You're an ethical vegan, right?
I'm an ethical vegan. I don't think that it's certainly not. It doesn't have to do with taste, and I'm not absolutely sure it's the healthiest diet in the world, but I would say that it is the most ethical diet in the world.
Would you eat synthetic meat? Clean?
Oh, definitely.
You would.
Absolutely. I'm just waiting for the day.
Waiting for the hamburger to come down in price from $300,000 where it is now
to $10. Yes. I'm the first in the line to the clean meat hamburger.
Well, I was thinking about this, morality versus pragmatic problems to be solved. My latest column in Scientific American is on abortion, and I tried to. There's already been so much written about this. What's there new to say? So I was trying to think of it as what's the problem here? And the problem is unwanted pregnancies. Well, what do we do about that? Well, education, birth control technologies, empowerment of women, economic and political empowerment of women, and so on. And yet I got pushback from a lot of pro-choicers saying, no, pro-lifers don't really care about unwanted pregnancies and fetus. They want to control people's sex lives. Back to that kind of deeper, old moral, old religious impulse to control people's, really basic things that they eat and sex, and then that role of disgust comes in. The definition of the Puritan, someone who's afraid that someone out there, someone else is having fun. We may be pushing up against some of these ancient traditions like that.
Yeah, but I don't think it's a good strategy to ascribe to your rivals the worst possible motive. I do think that there are good reasons to think that a lot of people who oppose abortion do it out of a deep ethical concern that fetuses are humans and that this is murder. Well, now, I'm not saying it's true, but I don't think that we should dismiss it so easily.
I agree.
It's just a ploy to control sexuality and to prevent people from having fun.
Yeah, right.
And personally, I'm not an expert on embryology, and I really don't know what is the truth about this issue of where exactly passes the line between a collection of cells and a human being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so
I think that in this case and in many other cases, being a bit more humble about our opinions, about what we know for sure versus what we imagine or what we think we know, would go at least some way towards tuning down the level of conflict and animosity and hatred between people.
I think so. Yeah, I think we can all agree that abortion is killing a living thing. Now, is it a human being? That depends on how you define that. It's not a person legally, because that's been decided, well, at least by the American Constitution. But a human being, here's the problem: the difference between the law and science. The law has to have an unambiguous categories: this or that, right or wrong, yes or no. Whereas science there is no place to draw the line. You can say for the end of the first trimester, well, but what, on this particular day at 3:00 is when it becomes a human being? I mean, it's just impossible to draw the line any one good place. So you end up in these kind of fuzzy categories.
Yeah, and it will become more and more complicated as not just our understanding of biology, but our abilities to manipulate the body and the brain will increase. These kinds of discussions about that we now have about abortion will be magnified, thousands of times, and will be far more complicated. What do you do about intelligent computers? What do you do about cyborgs? There are so many even more complicated problems waiting for us down this road.
You mean if an AI is sentient, considered to be sentient?
All kinds of such questions.
Yeah.
So, it's going to be Very difficult.
Oh no! Now we can't send these robots off to Alpha Centauri because then we're condemning them to a life of loneliness in a spaceship.
Could be.
Yeah. No. Because we would think of them as essentially slaves, but if they're sentient and conscious, then we really shouldn't be doing that. Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's very clear that if they are sentient, then they may be, they may be in many ways even more sentient than us. Now, personally, I don't think this will happen anytime soon, and maybe even never. I'm not convinced that AI is anywhere on the road to developing consciousness and sentience. It could happen. We don't understand consciousness well enough to decide one way or the other. But so far, we have seen absolutely no evidence that artificial intelligence is on the path to developing consciousness. Intelligence and consciousness are very, very different things. Mm-hmm. Intelligence is the ability to solve problems. Consciousness is the ability to have feelings.
Right.
Humans and other mammals solve problems by having feelings. But computers do it in a very different way. And, this example that just as airplanes fly faster than birds without ever developing feathers, so computers could become far more intelligent than us without ever developing consciousness.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then they have no moral status. Even if the robot is far more intelligent than me, if it has no consciousness, no mind, no ability to suffer, it has absolutely no right. It's just like a knife or a table in this respect.
Right.
But really, we don't know where we are heading.
At a social function several years ago, I met I think it's David Ferrucci, the guy that was in charge of the IBM program to create Watson, the computer that won Jeopardy. This was right after the Jeopardy championship, and so I asked him, does Watson know that he won Jeopardy? Was he excited? Like, he beat the great Ken Jennings. Did he let out a big yell like, yeah, I won? And of course, this is the problem of other minds. How would you know? I mean, he could program in there to let out a scream like, yeah, I won, but it wouldn't be feeling the excitement of having won, presumably.
As far as we can tell, absolutely not.
Yeah. Yep. So that's, well, I agree with you. I think we're a long ways from anything like that happening, decades at least, if not a century or so. So I'm not too terribly worried about that. Well, Yuval, we've been going for almost an hour and a half, so I think maybe we'll wrap it up here. And congratulations on your third book. I'm not sure how you're going to top this. You've done the past, the future, and now the present. What's next on your agenda for research and writing?
I have no idea. Maybe it's my last book. I don't know.
Oh, no.
Maybe I'll move to fiction. All kinds of things can happen.
Right. Yes. Well, yeah. Well, you're a beautiful writer, so fiction would be good. And, I've been thinking about that as well because, you can only reach so many people through nonfiction, but look how many people watch films and read novels. I mean, it's just staggering how many more people you can reach through the storytelling genre.
Yeah. Yeah, that's for sure.